This week on Jerusalem Dateline, Iran and Israel face off in a war of words and threats. Could a military confrontation be far off? Plus, the growing threat of China and what it means to the free world. And how to pray about a world that seems poised on the verge of war. And the true color purple from 3,000 years ago and how it confirms the Bible. All this and more this week on Jerusalem Dateline. Hello and welcome to this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell. Iran denied a request by French President Emmanuel Macron to include Saudi Arabia in negotiations for a new nuclear agreement. It's one of the latest developments in the effort to keep Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. President Macron warns that time is growing short to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. Iran says it's reaching its goal of producing 20% enriched uranium faster than expected. 20% is one step away from weapons-grade uranium.
We were supposed to produce 120 kilograms of 20% uranium annually, but now in less than 1 month, we haven't reached about 17 kilograms, which is even ahead of our timetable.
While the Biden administration says it wants to negotiate a stronger, better nuclear deal, Iran and its ally Turkey refuse that offer. Iran wants to use its leverage to drop the economic sanctions.
I should emphasize this. America was the one who withdrew from the JCPOA and breached its commitments. Now it's America that should return to the JCPOA and fulfill its commitments.
It also set a February 21st deadline for the EU signatories to drop sanctions, or it will cut off access for UN nuclear inspectors and increase uranium enrichment. The Biden administration is considering naming Robert Malley as its envoy to the nuclear negotiations. Critics like Senator Tom Cotton said the choice of Malley would send the wrong signal to Iran. He tweeted, "It's deeply troubling that President Biden would consider appointing Rob Malley to direct Iran policy. Malley has a long track record of sympathy for the Iranian regime and animus towards Israel. The Ayatollahs wouldn't believe their luck if he is selected." In the meantime, Israel is watching closely. And on Sunday, Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz told an Egyptian TV station it's keeping open its military option to stop Iran's nuclear program. The U.S. Senate committee voted to back President Biden's nominee for ambassador to the United Nations, paving the way for full Senate approval. Linda Thomas Greenfield is pledging to continue the fight against the anti-Israel BDS movement at the international body. CBN News correspondent Julie Stahl shows us what the BDS movement is all about.
It's called BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement.
BDS are in fact all about creating political pressure on the State of Israel to allow economic, academic, and cultural boycott or pressure on the State of Israel to allow millions of Palestinians to return to the State of Israel.
Author Anat Wilf says BDS uses what she calls the Placard Strategy.
Placard Strategy is the equations that everyone who goes to an anti-Israel demonstration sees on their placards. Zionism equals, or Israel equals, or Star of David equals. It never says Zionism equals the political movement for self-determination of the Jewish people in their homeland, which is the accurate definition.
And Wilf says it's been very effective, even though the equations are lies.
There are words like colonialism, racism, apartheid, sometimes even Nazism, and genocide. These words are all chosen because in our collective consciousness, they connote evil. Basically, people are exposed to an ongoing refrain that says, Zionism, Israel, Star of David equals evil.
It's not only about slogans on placards at demonstrations.
It's in the United Nations, it's on television. Give an anti-Israel speaker 30 seconds on television, they'll manage to say Israel, Zionism, colonialism, apartheid, genocide in the same sentence, regardless of what is the question.
BDS often claims to be a grassroots movement, But Sachi Gavrieli says there's nothing grassroots about it.
One could be operating in New York, one could be in Italy. It's a network operated and being headquartered from Ramallah by an element or organization called the BNC, the BDS National Committee.
Wilf says there's nothing new about the movement.
The Palestinians are still committed to their old goal of no sovereign state for the Jewish people in any borders anywhere. The BDS movement continues the same old idea that the Jewish people are uniquely evil, that the world will be a better place if there was no Jewish state in it, which again is a very ancient anti-Semitic theme.
Both Wilf and Gavrieli said it's important to keep fighting.
Continue very vigorously and with chazak ve'ematz, as the Lord said, be very strong to tell the truth about Israel.
First thing is really to expose BDS for what it is, that it might be non-violent in its means, but it is very violent in its ends, about the fact that it's not about peace. And ultimately, they should be confronted on campuses, in the media, everywhere which they operate, to expose them for their sinister purposes.
Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Up next, the growing menace of China and what it means for the free world. China is the greatest threat to freedom and democracy. That warning came from the former top U.S. intelligence official who said America should also prepare for an open-ended period of confrontation with Beijing. George Thomas has the details.
Napoleon Bonaparte, the French military leader, said more than 2 centuries ago that China is a sleeping lion. Let her sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world. China's President Xi Jinping has emphatically declared that the lion has awakened.
John Ratcliffe, Director of National Intelligence, wrote in a recent Wall Street Journal editorial that China is America's #1 national security threat and that Beijing intends to dominate the rest of the planet economically, militarily, and technologically. Michael O'Hanlon is with Brookings Institute.
It is the way a great power with a non-democratic government chooses to seek to extend its influence worldwide.
Ratcliffe accuses China of deploying what he calls a rob, replicate, and replace approach in its ambitions to dominate the world.
It's been well known for decades that China tries to copy the industry of other countries and then takes it to scale, makes it more efficient, and largely operates, built its way up through the global economic ranks with that approach.
China's foreign ministry dismisses Ratcliffe's claims while accusing Washington of unnecessarily playing the China threat.
The relevant article with its sensational title does not present any solid evidence at all. It offered nothing new but repeating the lies and rumors to smear China.
CBN News has documented China's rise for more than 2 decades. Fast forward to 2020 as we examine how China's President Xi Jinping has been massively overhauling the country's military, economy, and political influence as part of his great rejuvenation project.
Which, to put it into sort of Trumpian terms, means to make China great again.
Tom Miller documents China's rise in the book China's Asian Dream. Miller says since taking the reins, Xi has been on a trajectory of preparing China to be the world's dominant power.
China has been very, very deliberately trying to realize its kind of ambition to become the global superpower.
Chinese scholars say it's also part of Xi's deep belief that his country has a divine right to rule the world.
The mandate of heaven is from China's imperial past, where Chinese emperors believed that they not only had the right, but they were compelled by heaven to rule the world. And there's this notion of tianxia, or all under heaven.
One way is by military force. As commander-in-chief of the world's largest fighting force, Xi has remade China's People's Liberation Army, or PLA, into a military rapidly closing the gap on U.S. firepower. The Pentagon revealing for the first time that China now has the world's largest navy and plans to double its nuclear warhead arsenal in this decade, which includes ballistic missiles that can reach the United States.
It is likely that China will seek to build a military that is equal to, or in some cases superior to, the U.S. military or the military of any other great power that China perceives as a potential threat.
O'Hanlon says China's capabilities in emerging technologies such as robotics, artificial intelligence, and next-generation technology and telecommunications now rival that of the United States.
If we used to be ahead of China by, half a lap on the proverbial track, now we're ahead by maybe a few strides. And China is maybe even closing the gap further as we go.
Ratcliffe insists that resisting China's ambitions of becoming an economic, military, and technological superpower will be the challenge of our generation, and warns that America should prepare for an open-ended period of confrontation with Beijing. George Thomas, CBN News.
Up next, a conversation about how to understand the times and how to pray for the world. Many Christians around the world are concerned about the growing persecution of the church, cancel culture, and the possibility of war. To address these concerns redemptively and how to pray about these times, Rick Ridings, co-founder of Sukkot Hallel, a 24/7 prayer ministry here in Jerusalem, wrote an article called Intercession and Prayer, How to Intercept World War III. I spoke with Ridings about his prayer strategy detailed in the article. Rick, thanks for joining us on Jerusalem Dateline. You wrote recently that this time is one of the most important times to be praying since World War II. What did you mean by that?
I meant there's a global warfare. Many times people just look at what's going on in their country or one or two countries, but there really is a global spiritual warfare going on that I believe is the greatest since World War II. At that time, they were being barraged with news day after day of Hitler getting another victory, of him beginning to exterminate the Jews, and it looked like there was no way to stop him. If you just went by what you saw in the news at that time, it seemed totally hopeless, and why even pray? What good will it do?
You mentioned Rees Howells. Why was he so instrumental in World War II, and what's the lesson for today?
He was the head of a Bible college in Wales, and they had really learned in intercessory prayer not to just pray in reaction to what you see on the ground happening around you or in the news, but to wait on the Lord in worship and prayer until you could really begin to have God's perspective and begin to find out what does God want to do in the future. So, for example, in World War II, when it looked like it was all over, that Hitler was really decisively winning, the Lord showed them to pray that Hitler would go into Russia. As a military man, he should have known better than to go into Russia with a lot of his troops right before winter. But he went in. They prayed that he would not be able to take Moscow quickly as the news was predicting. And Hitler just got stuck in the snow. And it severely crippled everything else he did. And from there on, that was the turning point of World War II.
Rick, you talk about 5 phases of prayer. The first 2 are about intercepting World War III and a time of war and a time of peace.
I felt in 2017 that the Lord spoke to my heart that there was going to be great harvest coming in places like Iran, Saudi Arabia. And I felt like he said when that would begin, Satan would try to cut it off the same way he did with World War I, which occurred right after the great outpourings of the Holy Spirit in Wales, in Azusa Street, in Korea. There was a great missions movement of young people from universities going in large numbers. And then Satan succeeded in stirring up World War I. And young people who would have gone into missions instead were sent into the war and died in the war. And I felt like the Lord said, don't be ignorant of Satan's schemes. He will try to start a World War III when the harvest begins. And you are to encourage people to pray that be stopped in the way that Rees Howells saw World War II come to an end.
In the next 2 phases, Rick, you talk about geographical areas, Taiwan and the South China Sea. And also you talk about the capitals here in this region,
Ankara, Tehran, and Moscow. Talk about those.
I felt the Lord began highlighting that already in 2019 very clearly to us, that there would be an evil alliance forming between Ankara and Tehran and Moscow. Right after the Lord showed us that, they're traditional enemies. It didn't make sense that those three would work closely together. Right after the Lord showed us that, a week later, they met in Ankara with the three foreign ministers of those nations. So I believe there's something evil, but we're not fighting flesh and blood. We're fighting against principalities and powers, but principalities use personalities. And so we need to cut it off at that level. And I felt the Lord showed the same thing would happen in China, that China would begin by moving on Taiwan. And if that was not stopped early on, it would grow into a regional war. And if those two regional wars happened at the same time, they could spin out of control into a World War III.
You talk about the mantle of Rees Howells. What did you mean by that?
The mantle was this understanding and revelation that we're not to just pray according to what we see with our eyes or think with our minds or our political opinions, but that we're to worship and pray until the Lord begins to show us things as He sees them, because He's delegated authority on the earth to the believers. And we are to pray and proclaim His will upon earth as it has already been decided in heaven.
And finally, Rick, what are you there at Sukkot Hillel praying right now?
Well, we're praying, obviously, protection over Israel. We're praying protection and grace in the Middle East, that it not turn in, if there's any kind of military action necessary with Iran, that would happen quickly and decisively and within God's boundaries, preferably covert warfare to stop their nuclear bomb plans, rather than an overt warfare, and to pray that the harvest will continue to go forth in a great way in Persia, in Iran, and in the Middle East. And also, we're praying much that this is a season where we believe God is stirring up the Jewish people to come home from places like New York, where there's such an anti-Semitism being expressed right now. And when they're here, then Ezekiel 37 says that once the bones are connected, God will begin to breathe upon them by His Holy Spirit. And that's where your listeners can pray for that breath of the Holy Spirit from the north, south, east, and west upon this land.
Well, Rick Ridings, appreciate your article and your exhortation to be praying at this very important time.
Always a joy to be with you, Chris. Bless you.
Up next, a groundbreaking discovery that sheds new light on the Bible from the time of King David and King Solomon. For the first time, Israeli archaeologists have recovered 3,000-year-old pieces of fabric from the time of King David and King Solomon. The groundbreaking discovery sheds new light on the Bible, from the book of Genesis to the Gospels. The discovery took place on this hill in southern Israel. Archaeologists found the royal color purple fragments in the Timna Valley, and through carbon dating, confirmed the fabric had been preserved for 3,000 years.
The real excitement was when Dr. Naama Sukenik, called me one day. She told me, well, we found this proof, the molecules of the color from the lab. It's true purple.
True purple comes from an ancient, sophisticated process using dye extracted from sea snails found in the Mediterranean Sea. It usually took a lot of work and thousands of snails, which made the dye sometimes worth more than gold. The dry desert conditions in the valley preserve the fabric.
So we found in Timna the argaman, the more purplish color, which is associated with kings. Also the priests and also the tabernacle. It provides an excellent background to the biblical record for this particular time.
The region is mentioned a number of times in the Bible. The Timna Valley is located in the Negev Desert in southern Israel, and it's also the area of the Kingdom of Edom.
In the book of Genesis, chapter 36, we hear about the Kings of Edom that ruled over the land of Edom before Israel had kings.
This land is also where Gideon defeated the Midianites.
We hear in the book of Judges about the kings of Midian. When Gideon, he killed all the Midianite kings, the spoil is actually the purple, the argaman garments. So we really have a physical evidence. You can, touch the garment of an important figure, if not the king, of these people 3,000 years ago.
And where David defeated his foes.
We read in the Bible that King David went to south of the Dead Sea, the Valley of Salt, in the book of Samuel, and then he conquered the Edomites and put garrisons all over the land.
Royal purple is also mentioned in the New Testament. Lydia from Thyatira in the book of Acts was known as a seller of purple, and purple is mentioned in the Gospels.
We hear that the Romans, they actually forced Jesus to wear a purple robe in preparation to the crucifixion. The Romans claimed that he wanted to become the king of the Jews.
Ben Yosef believes this discovery revolutionizes our understanding of the Bible.
I think that this is a game changer in the way archaeologists and biblical scholars understand the reality at that time period.
Some archaeologists dismiss the Bible because there's no traditional architectural evidence for ancient kingdoms like a city or a palace. But he says they were nomadic kingdoms that left little evidence behind.
If you change the way you think about kings and kingdoms in this early period, and you understand that nomadic tribes could have had a kingdom, then suddenly everything, I think, becomes much more simpler to understand and to interpret.
He sees the pieces of royal purple fabric as evidence of these ancient biblical kingdoms and their kings. This is one of the more extraordinary stories coming out of Israel, confirming the biblical record. Well, that's all for this edition of Jerusalem Dateline. Thanks for joining us. Remember, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also access CBN content through our CBN News and other CBN apps. And don't forget to sign up for our email blast so you can continue to receive all of our exciting CBN content. I'm Chris Mitchell. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.